I'll throw down. Right?
Yes. So it is believed, we don't have a lot about William's younger life. While he was in England, we believe he was influenced by the Puritans, the separatists there. He went to Cambridge University. Now this is interesting. This is the 1600s. And in order to graduate, this is just mind-blowing stuff, you had to sign this subscription book. And this meant that you subscribed to all of the views of the Church of England. And by all accounts, Roger did not like this idea, but signed it so he could get his diploma, but did not go on to do any graduate work because he could not bear to sign that book again, knowing that he disagreed with it. But just imagine that. You know, you did all the work, you did all the qualifications, but if you don't say you agree with everything in this book, sorry, we don't give degrees to those people. So we know that he did not feel good about this, and he kind of started into the master's program but then quit, and it appears that it was because his conscience was bothering him and he knew he couldn't sign that book again. He became a very ardent separatist and felt that the Church of England was actually a false church, and that anyone who was really a Christian must withdraw from it. So, pretty extreme. And, when you had those kind of beliefs in the early 1600s, you had to get out of town. That's right, Howard saw where that was going. James did not like people like this. He didn't even like it when you skipped church, much less challenge the whole thing. So he headed off to Boston in about 1630. Well, the early churches there, because we talked some about the people who came over. Many were kind of your pioneers and your kind of rough and tumble folks who wanted adventure, but a lot of them were people who wanted freedom of religion in some way. And churches had trouble finding trained ministers. And so he shows up, and it had been maybe 25 years that the colonies had been there, so still pretty young overall. The Boston church, he showed up, and they offered him the position of pastor, but he wasn't real comfortable with how connected they still were to the Church of England. And so he declined and decided to move along. And, being good Boston people, they were like, that's fine, best of luck to you, hope everything goes well. No. They called ahead and warned the other churches that a crazy man who didn't like the church was on the way. So seriously, he went to Salem, and the church, as soon as he came into town, the church offered him a position. But then the message came from Boston, and they were like, we're going to have to withdraw our offer, because they were concerned. Doesn't that sound like somebody on the phone? I'm just concerned about Diane. That kind of stuff. So he moved again to Plymouth, and this was just outside of the jurisdiction of the Massachusetts Bay Company. One thing that we overlook in our study of history, especially colonial history, is the power of some of these companies. Because, boy, if you get into India, maybe we'll talk about that some other day. But the East India Company, the Massachusetts Bay Company, they had the power and control from the king, because they were out there setting up things to send money back home. So they had incredible influence. But anyway, kind of outside of their area, things were a little less rigid. And he started working as an assistant pastor in the church in Plymouth. And he farmed like everybody else did, and preached, and interacted a great deal with the Native Americans there. He began kind of trading with them and studying their languages. And then everything started kind of falling apart again, because here's this whole conscience thing. You notice how often this comes up. It causes nothing but trouble. So it bothered him that they were expected to go and tell the Native Americans that they were pagans and they had to convert. it was bothering him that the kind of, we'll just say aggressive evangelism, if you know what I'm saying, just didn't seem right. He didn't feel like forcing someone to become a Christian was really biblical. Have to kind of give him a nod for that. This is actually from a biography written about him. He believed that to force them to convert to Christianity, again, that's all of South and Central America, they just said, you're now a Catholic, right? Would be monstrous and most inhumane, his words. He believed that using wiles and subtle devices to compel them to submit to that which they understood not would be like coercing an unwilling spouse to enter into a forced bed. So he just said, I can't do that. And that, of course, caused some tensions. And, then it happened. One of those Boston guys, they were still feeling a little jilted, accused him of being an Anabaptist. Remember how that was used as a nasty, nasty name for other people? So he was called into court. Seriously, I mean, Massachusetts Bay General Court. And they are like, okay, we need to understand what exactly your beliefs are. Make sure you're on the up and up. He was accused of defying civil authorities, warned that he could not keep spreading this craziness. And so it sounds like, I mean, how many times have we heard this story? You have one chance to recant and change your ways. I mean, every reformer in history, right? So, the four main points of contention that he had with what was going on. He did believe, and was very much in the minority, unfortunately, that the Native Americans were the rightful landowners. You can see how that would cause some ruffled feathers. He believed that it was not right to make a non-believer swear an oath or pray, because these were worshipful things to him, and what would they mean to someone who was not a believer? He thought that people in New England should not attend Church of England services. We knew he was kind of against them. And he also felt like civil magistrates shouldn't hold any power over a person's conscience. They're supposed to be secular in his mind, when, as we've talked about many times, it was all one and the same. Religion and politics were all the same thing. So they declared him guilty, told him he had 6 weeks to get out of town. That's pretty generous. I mean, 6 weeks is a long time. The governor kind of slipped him a note and said, they've already got a berth for you. You're getting sent back to England, you know. And so he ran because nothing good could have come of that. So he ran off into the wilderness, and the only reason he was able to survive the winter was relationships he had cultivated with the Native Americans, who had not forgotten his kindness to them and took care of him. And so once the winter passed, I'm just like, why settle in the north? No, but people were never meant to live that far north. Anyway, I mean, if they had started in Georgia, think how many fewer stories of dying during the winter we would have. I mean, I'm being serious. Why Boston? Anyway. So he canoed down the river, found this beautiful place, bought it from the natives. Of course, I'm not sure they really understood what was going on because of the way they thought about ownership. But still, he tried to do right by them, built an altar, gave thanks to God, and he named his new home Providence. What grief! Within 4 years, about 40 families lived in Providence, and they had to start organizing themselves. That's what always happened. So they agreed to kind of common rules and committed themselves as a group to religious liberty and making sure that church and state were separate. Completely revolutionary idea. I mean, almost in the whole world, but definitely in the European history. They agreed that they would give equal land, because remember, you just kind of get a grant. There wasn't, like, nobody owned it and they said, okay, you can buy this from John. It was just, here's our land. So they would grant equal amounts of land to newcomers, and they would give special consideration to refugees. Huh, how interesting. And so they called their colony Rhode Island, and it became the first haven for people who sought religious freedom. And this, it was kind of like a town that was a church, interesting, because of the way that they ended up together and what drew them there. So in 1639, the town church, I mean, which is kind of ironic since they were trying to separate church and state, but they were all a congregation, I think. They decided, after much study, that baptism should be for believers only. Okay, this is good. And that church membership should be for believers only, which again is very different from the tradition. They decided that believers' baptism was the biblical thing that they were seeing and should follow a voluntary confession of faith. And so they formed, there in Providence, the first Baptist church on American soil. How do you like that? We thought all those people up north were just lost savages, but at least they had a good start. Williams was the first to be baptized. You remember we talked about who can baptize who, so apparently they just decided we're just going to do this because all of them had been baptized as infants. And so the first Baptist church on American soil. So around that same time, a fellow named John Clark, very similar backstory from England, very, very much unhappy with the religious practices both in England and in Massachusetts, founded another church in Newport, Rhode Island. And Williams and Clark together actually got King Charles II to guarantee, they got a charter from him, a charter that guaranteed religious freedom in the colony of Rhode Island. So that was pretty big. I mean, that was a big success, but the battle for religious liberty was far from over. Because, there's not just one thing, but no matter what drove people to the New World, everyone, and I mean literally, all of them had grown up where church and state were the same thing. That's the only way they had ever seen it. And so, one, you have the whatever is familiar must be the best and right way. That's just our natural assumption. But also, there was a common belief that the only way to preserve society, for us to not devolve into savagery, was for to have a state church, to keep it at, so that people would be born into the church and that's where they would stay. It was they just believed that was necessary, and so the focus was very much on keeping those two things the same. So again, you can see where the fight comes in. And so in kind of the middle colonies, Pennsylvania, kind of up towards Rhode Island, it was a pretty safe zone. There was no established church. It wasn't like if you move in, you're automatically a member of the church. That was a pretty safe area. New England had a very established congregational church. Everyone in the colony was taxed, and that was your tithe, essentially. Your tax money went to the church. If you dissented, bad things happened, So that was not so good. And in fact, in Massachusetts, there's those Boston people. I have family in Boston. Baptists were seen as a cancer. Like, this is from the writings of the time. Not just, oh, they're troublesome. A cancer that will destroy our society because they're undermining what makes us as society. That's how they viewed it. And so, in 1644, not as long ago as we would hope, Massachusetts made a law that anyone who opposed infant baptism, or what they were ordered to do by the state church, would be banished. It became official. It was unofficial before. It still happened, but that was official. And they, anyone who was an Anabaptist would be bashed. And they were. This is a quote from writings of the time. They were the incendiaries of the Commonwealth and the infectors of persons in matters of religion. And so they were seen as a threat to the fabric of society, and were often whipped for having infants baptized, refusing to have infants baptized, and often excommunicated, even just for saying they thought it was a bad idea. So, down south, where the important stuff is. The Church of England was the established church in Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia. We'll focus on Virginia because it's just where everything important happens. I grew up in North Carolina, and my poor wife, who's a Virginian, she would be talking about something that happened. I was like, we never studied that. She's like, it's because nothing happened in North Carolina. You should have been studying real history. Baptists were seen as the kind of the lowest class, the least wealthy people in the society. So they were kind of looked down upon. Dissenters, people who didn't go to the Church of England and do what they were supposed to do, had to register their meeting place, they had to register their preachers, and they had to be licensed to preach at the proper times and in the proper places that were approved. So it was very carefully regulated, because it's still, just like in New England, it was punishable by law if you didn't go to church and if you didn't have your child baptized. So over time, there was a little more tolerance, but still, it's kind of relative, because you had to get your license, and then they'd say, okay, between these hours and these places, that's the only time you're allowed to preach, and you can imagine how that went over. If, this is all true, if you provided certificates from 3 different churches that proved you were a Baptist, then you could even have your automatic church tax stopped, so that you weren't paying money to the Church of England. See, that's all it took. Oh my. Our records show that the civil authorities had to throw Baptists in jail all the time because they didn't preach when they were supposed to in the places they were supposed to. They just decided that they were going to go where God led them. Yeah, you knew that was coming. And they were, again, I can't overemphasize this, they were seen as a threat to the health of the colony. And so, they were seen as heretics that needed to be destroyed. And I'm not really exaggerating that. And so they were persecuted. And again, our records tell us that the more they were thrown in jail, the louder they preached out the windows. Right? This is a great mental picture. So they would get thrown in there, and it kind of almost became a sideshow. So people would come and hang out outside the jail to see these crazy people, but they were hearing the preaching, and so the government would hire people to stand outside the jail and play drums and yell and make noise to try to drown out the preaching, which I'm sure just made them preach all the louder. How neat to use being in jail as an opportunity for evangelism.
You've heard about John Waller here, haven't you?
Yeah.
You've heard that story.
Yeah, so same thing.
He had so much food, he started a food bank. People brought him so much food, he couldn't eat it, so he gave it to the poor.
That's great. Yeah. So then, shifted into the Revolutionary War era. This was interesting because in general, Baptists felt more oppressed by the colony governments than by Britain. See what I'm saying? So they didn't think, we've got to throw off the yoke of oppression. They were thinking, you're oppressing us, you right here. So the Baptists were in an odd position there. Most of our Baptist ancestors opposed Britain's rule kind of on political grounds, but in terms of their freedom of religion, the British government didn't try to stop them from doing anything. You see, so So a lot of Baptists hoped that in the course, especially in the South, hoped that breaking away from England would lessen the power of the Church of England and kind of loosen their grip on those colonies there. There were Baptists who were allowed to preach to troops during the war, forerunners of what we would call chaplains. Out of the colonies, which there's two of them that had by far the most growth among Baptists during the kind of the late 1700s. Where would you think Baptists would grow the fastest?
The Northern Baptist.
No, just Baptists. I didn't say Northern.
Oh.
Any colony. Come on, there's only 13. Pick one.
North Carolina.
Where would you think? No, not North Carolina. The South was a tough place for Baptists then. New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Again, not what we would think of as bastions of Baptisthood, but during that time, those were places that had the least established churches. So, you hearing me? And so it was the easiest for Baptist churches to flourish there because they weren't getting thrown into jail constantly by a government that didn't like them. So anyway, Isaac Backus, he was a prominent member of the Rhode Island community and became a powerful and well-known figure in the speaking out for religious liberty. And he formed the Grievance Committee. You know, and when I read that, I was like, every church should have a grievance committee. That's a great. And their purpose was to champion religious liberty on behalf of Baptists. As far as we can tell, this was the first organized religious lobby in American politics. Like it was actually designed to try to put pressure on the government. It didn't really work, but they tried. I mean, that was what they didn't make a whole lot of headway for a long time. But they worked on that, and he came up with the idea of refusing to pay the church tax. So kind of a civil disobedience sort of thing. And so we had this thing where the civil leaders would say the colony has every right to compel their people, whoever, you know, Baptist or not, to submit to the religious authorities. And so they would seize property, they'd throw them into jail, they'd leave them there until they'd starve to death. You know, they were very serious about all that stuff. So we're getting into the 1770s, you know, constitutions are being talked about and all this sort of stuff, and Backus and others argued against some of the original drafts of the Constitution because it did not address religious liberty. And in fact, he led the fight against the first Massachusetts Constitution. And this is funny, because again, these are state constitutions, which is different, but the nation's constitution was based mostly on the state ones. The original version in Massachusetts still had compulsory religious taxation and compulsory church attendance. Wouldn't that be great if that had been in our Constitution? I think others would have fought against that eventually, but I'm just saying. So, you know, they made some compromises by saying, well, I guess each person can decide which church gets their tax or something like that. But, you know, it just went round and round and round. Backus died long before he ever got to see his dream of religious liberty become true. That's true of a lot of trailblazers. Now, some more great names. John Leland, anybody? Leland, yes. Leland Center for Theological Education, named for him. And James Madison. I think, isn't that like a bakery or something?
Dolly.
Dolly. Get them mixed up. They may have named a school after this guy. So Leland was a minister, an author. He was born in Massachusetts, but once he was saved, he thought, I need to go to God's country, and moved to Virginia. And Madison, politician, he had been exposed to Baptist preaching and was anti-established religion. And those two, you know, they had a lot of debates. You know, they were frenemies, I guess we would call them these days, because they went back and forth at each other, but were friends and co-workers in a lot of ways. And so these guys worked on, what do you call those things you get signatures on? A petition? They petitioned the government when the Virginia General Convention was working on its constitution. They continuously lobbied for religious liberty for all groups, not just themselves. And eventually, it took Virginia roughly 10 years to come up with a bill on religion, and their idea was to establish Christianity and exclude all other religions, which was very popular among the established churches. And that sounds like a great idea, but it's still the same principle. You get that, right? The idea of saying, it's okay for our leaders to be, to let religion lead sounds great until you consider that there are other belief systems and that we would be pushing them down just as our ancestors were pushed down. But when they started saying, that we're just going to say everybody's Christian, period, even the general and particular Baptists got together on this one, and they pitched huge fits, and people got very whipped up, fortunately, and that was defeated. And it was a few years later that Thomas Jefferson wrote the bill for establishing religious liberty. Now here, this is government in action. He wrote that bill in 1779. It passed in 1786. That's probably fast in government terms, but boy. So once again, Virginians leading the way. And so we have this brand new government, brand new constitution. And the Constitution itself doesn't really say anything about religion. You knew that, right? It just doesn't really talk about it. Leland really wanted, at the heart of the Constitution, guarantees of religious liberty, and he was gearing up to lead the fight to defeat our Constitution, the one that you've read and seen, that one. He was ready to really attack it, but James Madison, his buddy, he said, listen, I need you to support this. We need this Constitution, and as soon as it's passed, I'll get on this. And he was as good as his word, because not long after the Constitution narrowly passed, that was a squeaker, right? I don't know if you've studied that part of history. It was a squeaker. He came out with the Bill of Rights, and that's a really good thing. Amendment 1. We've been talking a lot about the Second Amendment lately. How about the first one? Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. And so, by 1833, every wheels turn slow in government. By 1833, all of the United States, all the states in the U.S., had in their constitutions something that affirmed the principle of the separation of church and state with full religious liberty. That was a fight, and that was our folks, our ancestors who led that. And once that battle had been won, Leland became a missionary to the heathen Yankees in Massachusetts and tried to save them. No, that's really what he joined the legislature there and continued his career. I can't help knocking Yankees. They're just so different from us. I don't know. They talk funny. One of my favorite things, where were we? We were in Georgia, South Carolina, at a rest stop, and I hear these people, where are the bagels? Got Krispy Kreme around here. We don't have bagels. Anyway, it's just so fun. But they're, what?
Biscuits and gravy.
That's right. Got real breakfast out here. All right. That's all I have for tonight. We're actually finished a little early. What comments, questions, thoughts do you have? Come on, Suzanne. You haven't, guessed what I'm doing next week yet.
I'm thinking of Dave Barton. He says there's no way out in the Constitution that says there is a separation of church and state.
Not in the Constitution, in the Bill of Rights.
Although,
See? Completely different.
do you ever listen to him?
I don't know who he is.
No. He's good.
Yeah. So, and here's what's funny, you know, and this was years and years ago in Fayetteville, but we were talking about this kind of stuff with folks, and you know, just kind of asked, so, should we stop this separation of church and state, you know? And yeah, we should. You know, and then of course the next question is, well, you're assuming that the governor or the mayor or the police chief is a Christian. What if it was a Muslim? Oh, wait. You see, and that's the thing. Is we, you know, and again, this is a good going on 40 years worth, but you know, there was the rise of this group that said we need to get church back into government, you know, and that is what our Baptist forebears fought tooth and nail for years and years and years and years. And I find it terribly ironic and sad that some Baptists are the ones saying, why do we have these? This is a terrible idea. You get to have your own opinion on that. I kind of fall on the religious liberty side. But yeah, so it is not in the Constitution per se. Other comments, questions? Nothing?
I think it's almost like all of this attention and the things that have happened with our Confederate statues and all of that. Those were people who fought. And a lot of them were our ancestors. And I don't think it's necessarily something that should be taken down and destroyed because another segment of group of people in our society deem it not.
I understand where they're coming from,
Well, I do too, but still, I
That-
don't think that.
but they should not be taken down and destroyed. Could be moved to a park with history attached
Protected.
while they're
history
there.
keepers.
I understand, but, you know, enough whining, crying out loud.
And for those of us who are history buffs, and like you said, want to be able to follow that, there's somewhere to follow it. It's not just gone.
Well, they voted, they had a straw poll, they're gonna change Lee Davis and another one, and the general population, 3-1, said, no,
Stonewall
keep the name.
Jackson, Stonewall Jackson.
Keep the name.
Yeah, the school board announced it this morning.
What was it
Good.
now?
It's not like you've,
That the public.
it's not like
came
you've got an
forward and
altar
said
to
we
these
wanna leave it.
guys.
They've been trying that for years. Our kids went
In the
to
schools.
Davis.
They went-
They changed them to the
The
Bulldogs.
junior high is called Stonewall Jackson
Stonewall,
too.
yeah.
You know, I can sympathize with people who, we fought a war to keep slavery.
Matter of fact, we used to go
You know,
I know.
to the
But-
football games. They had a horse with someone,
Traveler.
Traveler
With
horse
Robert
with
Lee.
Robert Lee riding around.
That stopped. They had to stop that. They took Dixie Away as the touchdown song.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that was the state song of Virginia, Dixie was, I don't know if it's still is.
Yeah, and that's a touchy thing. There are a lot of different sides to that, you know. But you know, and this is difficult for white people and particularly white men to think of. But as an example, if there was a group that had spent all of their lives trying to make sure that women were never real people and never allowed to vote or never allowed to go to school and had fought tooth and nail to make sure that you never had the chance to sit in a Bible study because you'd be sitting outside. And then if every time you turned a corner there was a monument to those people, it might bother you.
Yeah, but like I said, that's okay. I understand. I'm like John, I understand that, but let's put it somewhere where
No, yeah,
it's
yeah.
preserved.
don't edit history.
Right.
Supposedly Congress passed a law making all Confederate soldiers veterans, and then it's illegal to destroy a veteran monument or a grave.
Yeah, see, and so many of those were just normal people. They weren't, I mean, yes, some of them were fighting to keep slavery, but not most of them were normal guys.
Most of it was states' rights though.
Who were just
You know,
fighting
that's
because,
what that war was
because
about.
they're,
It wasn't really
yeah, the
about
people said
slavery.
they're attacking us, you know?
My great-great-grandfather was a brigadier general in the Civil War, and he is buried in Fredericksburg in the Confederate Cemetery, so I have a,
Yeah.
you know,
Confederate cavalry, all through my Georgia roots. Yeah, so I don't think they were nasty people there, but I get it. I get it.
yeah.
So it's hard when we've always been the majority. You know, I think it would help us all if we were minorities for a little while.
But thank you for sharing that our roots as Baptists, what these people fought for, so we would have it. Because a lot of people don't know that.
Yeah, yeah.
They just
A
call
lot more
themselves a
involved
Baptist,
in
but
the-
they don't really realize what took place for that
Yeah.
to happen.
Well, and that's, I'll get more into this in a few more weeks. I'm not really sure how many, but in many ways, well, the Southern Baptist Convention particularly has ended up almost back, they're more Catholic than anything else right now, which I hope will make sense given our discussion of history. And I'll explain what I mean by that when we talk about it, but they've gone back away from some of the things that made us Baptists in the first place.
Yes,
which has
some of
been
them,
a really
it's one
sad
group
thing.
of Baptists that have gone more to the Calvinist
Yes,
ideas.
that's part of the larger movement that I'm talking to.
Yeah, that's it.
I mean, yeah, it's really, for people who study history, it's just like, how can this happen? How can this happen? It just seems so backwards, but, you know.
You'll get into the modern day
Yes, I'm gonna take us right up to today.
political
Yeah,
thing. I never paid much attention to it until that got.
I'll tell you the story as best I know.
Southern Baptist and CBF and BGAB
Yep.
and ABC and.
I'll walk you through all of it.
But you saw a thing about the split between Virginia Baptist and the CBF
Yes.
about the dues. No, I don't know. I've asked our treasurer. I said, how much do we? Maybe we should. Do we support CBF? Well, we did through BGA. I don't know
Okay.
the numbers.
Through the BGA.
Yeah.
BGAB. And now BGAB is not gonna send CBF money.
Okay.
So, do we need to make a decision here?
We might need to
To stop?
revisit where our money goes.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, do we have to reassign? Do we wanna support CBF, or do we wanna withdraw it altogether?
Yeah,
So I don't know how much. She said it was not a big amount,
right.
but, we did have some money assigned to them.
Yeah, we'll even tackle that.
Alright.
The most cutting edge stuff, but yeah, definitely the controversies of the 80s and all that stuff. Yep. So, yeah, by the time we finish, you'll know everything there is to know about that.
Oh, dear.
Or at least the short version. All right, let's close with a word of prayer. Father, we do thank you as always for the people who devoted their lives, who took the hard knocks, who went to jail, who suffered to follow you and do what you had laid on their hearts. And they did those things to try to make the world better for themselves, for their children, for people who disagree with them. And Lord, we want to embrace that heritage of sticking up for the freedom to choose you. We all need to be able to deal with you personally and not be forced or coerced or made to do anything. We know that doesn't accomplish your goals. And we want to be a part of the same kind of spirit of standing up for the freedom to worship. We thank you that we in this country, in this place, that we are able to choose where and how we worship you and how we connect with you. We're so thankful for that hard-won liberty. And just continue to guide us and teach us. In the name of Christ. Amen.
Thank you, Denise. We've always cut that wall to go with the
Right. Feels like nothing's ever happened. It just takes so long to get things through the loops of the committee.
There's a lot of patience.
I just stay away from politics.
Yeah, they were, yeah.
We'll get into missions. Missions is a lot more fun. I don't like it, it's kind of here. I can push all the time.
Go over 2 months. Yeah. I got lots of, at least you can sleep. He always tells me, I don't want you to